So, what was a funny situation you remember during your space missions? Well, there were many very serious parts, and there were a few funny parts, I must say. One of the very funny part was on the first servicing mission of Hubble. We were 7 crew members on board, and one of the crew members was believing very strongly in extraterrestrials, and he thought he had the capability to communicate with extraterrestrials. So sometimes he was isolating himself in a corner of the spaceship, and all the others were going to another corner. It's a small spaceship. Between the cockpit and the middeck of the space shuttle, there's not that much volume. But when this, I'm not going to mention his name, but when this crew member wanted to have communication with extraterrestrial, we just left him alone, and we went to the other compartment. And when he said he had finished his communication, then we went back to him. We don't really know what they were talking about, but the mission was successful eventually. Maybe there was some help provided by extraterrestrial, but anyway, that first servicing mission of Hubble in December 1963, STS-61, was a total success, thanks maybe to that communication capability of this particular crew member. Why did I decide to teach? Going in space is a very powerful and very strong experience. It is something that is really touching you very deeply. And this on one hand. On the other hand, you learn so many things that it would be unfair to keep this for yourself. So for me, I decided to teach because I wanted to share. I thought it was far too much for me to keep it for myself, whether it was, again, the emotions and the beauty of the scenery, or whether it was all the technical aspect that we were exposed during the whole training and then during the mission itself. We learned so many things. I could not keep it for myself. So I decided to teach and bring the message to students, and also on the occasion of lectures, not only to students, but to the public in general. Well, on the first mission, you discover a completely new environment. And I remember being a little bit worried before the first mission because I did not know the environment. And despite the fact that in the simulators, they were trying to reproduce the environment as well as possible, it was never really the same, especially the absence of gravity, which you cannot really simulate easily on the Earth. We can do it for a short time in an airplane following a parabolic trajectory. You can simulate it to a certain degree when you're in the water and you train for spacewalking. After your first mission, there are a lot of things that you know. There were big question marks before that first mission, and many of them are already answered. And you also have learned the strategies of handling the absence of gravity environment, which is not at all obvious because we have no experience of this here on the Earth. So I had the feeling I was significantly, and not only the feeling, but I definitely was significantly more efficient on the second mission than on the first one. The big step, I would say, is between the first one and the second one because of these question marks being no longer question marks. Then I did 4 total, and obviously on a number 3 and 4, I had gathered more experience. I did spacewalking on my very last one, which is of course something new, a new experience. But the big jump is really between the first one and the second one. The first one, a lot of question mark, and they were happily resolved during the first mission. And I could use what I had learned on that first one in making myself more efficient and being more productive on the second and subsequent missions. Well, why do I teach a course here at EPFL, Space Mission Design and Operations? I think after you have experienced something so deep, so profound, and so fascinating as I could, you have to pass a message. And I try to do it to schools, I do it to the public, but doing it to students in university seems to me a good use of my time. And in the wake of what I could experience, I think this is the best way to bring a certain profit and advantage to what I could experience. In Switzerland, we have been very few to go through this. I think I'm the only one so far. Switzerland is a small country. We only have 1 astronaut. We'll have more in the future, but We don't need many astronauts in Europe, and there are many nations, and small nations are not really pushed forward as the providers of astronauts. And I had this huge privilege and chance to be in the first group selected in 1978. And now I feel the responsibility really to capitalize on what I learned. And I would say translate in engineering terms what I learned in my training over there at NASA for 25 years. I spent quite a lot of time over there, and then pass a message to the students. And if I'm able in this way to motivate a few students to either go and work in the space business, space industry in the future, or at least have an interest in space activities and whatever they do in the future as engineers, that they can try to bring forward their interest, motivation, and knowledge for the service of space exploration and utilization of space, then I think I've fulfilled my goal, which is again to make what I learned and my experience profitable to students and to the public and to school children also. What was my biggest fear during my space missions? Well, it's not what one might think. It's not the fear of, I don't know, the fireball after liftoff. It's not really that kind of fear that we have. We are slightly worried during the ascent, especially the first stage of ascent of the space shuttle when we are attached with the two solid rocket boosters, which of course have been the cause of the Challenger accident. So there is a slight worry there, but it's not fear. In fact, during the ascent, depending on the position that we have on board the shuttle, of course, the commander has a highest position, the highest responsibility. The second in command is the pilot. Then we have the flight engineer, or the so-called mission specialist number 2, sitting between the commander and pilot, who has some responsibilities for the ascent. Mainly if there are problems, he's supposed to help resolve the problem, mainly in terms of the management of the systems on board the shuttle. And the others are less involved in the ascent. They are more there for the ride, in a way. Typically, the spacewalkers spend a lot of time training for spacewalks, so they don't spend much time training for the ascent and the entry phase, so they cannot occupy a position with high responsibility during these phases. But anyway, whether you have a high responsibility position like the commander, or the ones who are in the middeck have no responsibility at all for the ascent, there is a little bit of a concern for the first part of the ascent and the rest of it, but it's not fear. If I have to answer the question about fear, for me, I had the fear sometimes of doing something really stupid, something dumb, because I'm a human being, so I can make mistakes, something dumb that would have as a consequence that the mission goal cannot be reached, mainly in spacewalking. You spacewalk, there's a little room for error, but you could possibly do something dumb, and then bang! You can't really accomplish the goal of the mission, or maybe you can only reach part of this goal because you've done something dumb. So sometimes I had the fear of that. What was the most difficult situation? Well, I was fortunate we never had huge problems on my 4 missions and a total of 43 days in space. Where we had most of the problems were in the payloads or the equipment that we were working on, whether it was Hubble or whether it was Hubble or the tethered satellites. We had problems in these areas, but we never had in these 43 days, including ascent and entry, a big problem at the level of the shuttle. I would say that the most difficult situation was on the tethered satellite, on the second flight of the tethered satellite, the TSS-1R mission, STS-75, in February-March of 1996, when we had the tether break. And this was a very, very feared situation, the tether break, because you can imagine you have the space shuttle, you have a 20-kilometer long tether between the shuttle and the satellite, the tether being more or less along the local vertical with maybe some oscillations. And we had practiced a lot the response of the crew to a tether break, whether it was at the level of the satellite or whether it was somewhere in the middle between the satellite and the shuttle, or whether it was at the level of the deploy itself. You can imagine if we had had tether break at the level of the satellite or very far away from us, because of the elasticity of the tether would have come back to us. and would have piled in the cargo bay. The shuttle was pretty much with the belly to the Earth and the payload bay up, so the the tether was above the payload bay, and if it had broken up there, it would have piled in the cargo bay. That could have been a dangerous situation because it could have possibly prevented the doors from being shut down, except if we would have gone out to do a spacewalk in order to rearrange the tether or cut it and let it go. I mean, there were a lot of options, but when we had a tether break, for me, it was quite a stressful moment. We saw we have a tether break because the tension of the tether suddenly went to zero, and then we looked out and we saw something strange. The tether was moving away from us, but it had a kind of a helicoidal shape because the break had taken place at the level of the deployer. Fortunately, that was the best situation possible out of these three situations I mentioned: on top, in the middle, or in the bottom. But anyway, that was a very short difficult moment that we had, and we had to decide rapidly what we do. Again, fortunately, it was not dangerous, but it could have been, being a tether break that had a whole spectrum of possibilities, some of which being very dangerous. What is the most difficult thing to adapt to? I must say there is nothing really very difficult to adapt to because we are so well prepared. The training for typically 10-day mission with the space shuttle lasted about 1 year, together with the rest of the crew, so 7 crew members total. And we were really, really well prepared. I think that the painful or difficult situation mentally come from the fact that something happens and you are not prepared to respond properly to it. And we were really well prepared. The most difficult thing to adapt to, I would say, is probably the weightlessness. It did not last too long a time, but for a few hours, especially on the very first flight, when for the first time you experience this long duration weightlessness. We had done some flights in the KC-135, the zero-G airplane of NASA, and we knew what it was to be weightless for 15 seconds or 20 seconds. But when you have main engine cutoff at the end of the 8.5-minute ascent into space with the space shuttle, suddenly you are, with your launch and entry suit and your helmet and your gloves, you are suddenly exposed to this zero gravity. I was thinking on my very first ascent, STS-46 in the summer of 1992, I was thinking, Claude, are you really going to be able to work in these conditions? Once you get rid of your launch and entry suit, and when you move away also from the period where you don't feel too well physically, pretty much like seasickness for a while. It doesn't happen to all. It happens to most of us to a certain degree, but some of us astronauts don't have that. I had a little bit of that. When you get rid of the launch and entry suit, to take it out, and you are in light clothing, you feel a little bit better. And in the meanwhile, you have somewhat adapted to the way to move from one place to the other in weightlessness. At the beginning, you are completely clumsy. You really have no idea how to operate in this completely different environment. So I would say that that's probably the most difficult thing to adapt to, but it only lasts a few hours. The next day, it was already much better, and after 2 or 3 days you really enjoy the weightlessness, but the adaptation on your very first flight for the first few hours is tough. The zero-G flight we had performed were just there for us to know what weightlessness is. It's like, you want to know what G-force is. That's why we had a ride in a centrifuge where we had exactly the expected profile of the acceleration that we were going to have on the space shuttle, starting with about a G.5 and rising to about 2.2 at solid rocket booster separation, then going back down to about a G.5. This depends, of course, on the thrust-to-weight ratio on one hand, and also on the orientation of the spacecraft versus the gravity vector. And then after solid rocket booster separation, it was again relatively low. Then it was rising all the way to 3G. Then for the last about minute and a half of the ascent, we had 3G longitudinal acceleration. So we had a centrifuge ride where the exact profile of acceleration that we were going to have on the ascent to space and the space shuttle was reproduced. So we knew about moderate or relatively high G forces. Anyway, we did a lot of training in airplanes, the T-38, so 3G was not a big deal, although 3G longitudinal was very special because that's velocity added to the velocity. It's not the change in the direction of the velocity vector, which is what causes acceleration in a jet fighter or in a jet airplane when you do a tight turn. So above 1G was well known, so that was not a problem. But the 0G, of course, is very unusual. You cannot easily get this on Earth, except a trampoline. You can get this for a second, maybe, in between the acceleration period with the trampoline. And we had 1 or 2 flights on the KC-135 to experience a series of about 20-second 0G period in the parabolas. And then we had a pull-up at about 2G, and then again a next parabola at 20 seconds. So we had some kind of an idea what 0G feels like. But when you are on a real space flight and you get the main engine cut off and suddenly you're on 0G, but then that's 0G for 10 days. And on your very first flight, when you had very little exposure to that in the past, and the little disturbance that you have sometimes in your vestibular system causing some uneasy feeling, and you have to work because you have the crew activity plan and you're supposed to do something. That was tough on the very first flight. On the next flight, it's much easier because you know that even if you don't feel perfectly well, you know that you are going to be fine in a few hours, or at least the next day you are going to be okay. I wouldn't say that it was really an achievement. The achievement is achievement of the program in general. I mean, the Apollo program was an unbelievable achievement, and it reached very high goals in terms of the difficulty of the objective and getting to the moon. It was really an unbelievable achievement in the 60s. The shuttle program was also a great achievement. For me personally, I had dreams and goals and passion for a few things. When I was a kid, I had a passion for aviation. I had a passion for stars. I was an amateur astronomer. I was building airplane models, and I was witnessing the beginning of the space program in 1957 when Sputnik 1 was launched. I was 13 years of age, so I was a teenager, and I was marveling at what was happening. I remember that a short time afterward, the satellite Echo was launched. It was a big sphere, very, very simple communication satellite reflecting the radiation as well, electromagnetic radiation sent to it, or in the visible part of the spectrum also. So it was visible in the sky as a pretty bright object moving rapidly. I was about 15 years of age at that time, and I was fascinated by that. For me, it was a big inspiration. I remember we were on vacation with my family in the Swiss mountains, and I had a camera, and I was taking long exposures to see the trail of Echo passing in the sky. So I had a fascination for the sky. I had a fascination for airplanes also. I became an Air Force pilot and did this for about 30 years, flying various jet airplanes in squadron in the Swiss Air Force. But for me, when I was witnessing what was happening in the Soviet Union and in the United States in space exploration, I thought, well, this is amazing, this is fantastic, but it's not for a Swiss. The Swiss cannot do that. And it's only in the mid-70s, and I was just after 30 years of age, that I realized that the European Space Agency was going to come in also in the human spaceflight. With the participation in the shuttle program in the form of Spacelab and delivery of Spacelab and of experiments and joint missions with Americans to use the space for scientific research, and at the same time opportunity for European men and women to become astronauts. So immediately I thought, well, that's something I want to do. I was happy that I had a training in science on one hand, being an astrophysicist, but also in aviation, because joining NASA and the shuttle program, we were sent there, the three first European astronauts, Ulf Merbold, Wubbo Ockels, and myself, to Houston for shuttle training. Having been and being still an aviator was a big plus, because finally the shuttle was the extension of an airplane going outside of the atmosphere and going on orbit and carrying different things and different goals in the mission, then coming back to Earth and gliding for soft landing on the runway. for me, I was the happiest young man in the world going to Houston and having this combination of my interest in aviation and in space in general and astronomy satisfied in this training over there. I wouldn't say that it was a big achievement. The achievement was outside of myself. The achievement was achievement of the program. I was just following my goals and working pretty hard in order to not only satisfy my interest in this field, but also try to bring my contribution to it. What was nice over there at the Johnson Space Center at NASA is that outside of the training for spaceflight, we had job assignment. And I worked for a while with engineers on shuttle navigation in the early 80s. The different ways we're going to do precise navigation of the space shuttle using TACAN, which I use in aviation, but at that time we thought of using them also extensively for the shuttle. GPS was not yet existing. So I had the opportunity to learn a lot about the space shuttle and about spaceflight in general, not only through the training for the space shuttle, but also through the job assignment. The beginning of a bigger story, I'm not so sure. This was, for me, a goal that was slowly getting reached. Of course, the ultimate goal, which is the first space flight and then subsequent space flights, came for me quite a bit later. It was 1992, so 12 years after I came to Houston. So it took a while until I got my first flight. There was, of course, a Challenger accident in between, which delayed my first flight. And then the 90s were well, it was the best period of the space shuttle operation because it was after the Challenger accident and before the Columbia accident, and there were a lot of flight accomplished during this time and very, very productive and very interesting. A lot of dynamics in the shuttle program. I was privileged to fly these 4 missions and total of 43 days in space during that glorious time of the space shuttle. Okay, what current or future project drive me? Well, what I'm doing now, teaching at EPFL, is something that satisfies me a lot. So my plan is to continue doing this over the next few years. Obviously, my course is coming online now. I'm still giving the course also ex cathedra, like a normal professor in front of a blackboard and with a PowerPoint slide being projected. My goal is really to continue doing this for a few years still. As long as I feel I can bring something to students, to the academic community here in Lausanne and beyond, I will continue doing that. And also bringing the message to other people, to schools and to the public, as I mentioned. I like to travel also. And I spend a number of weeks traveling to various countries and discovering new landscapes and discovering new mentalities and new people also. I'm fascinated by travel. Now, this is travel on the surface of the earth, although there is some part of the travel which is in the atmosphere, taking airliners to South America or to Indonesia or to other places in the world. I enjoy travel a lot. So for me, travel, and when I travel, I try to, again, continue trying to bring to my fellow travelers. I normally travel in groups, sometimes as a guide or as a lecturer. I try to bring the message of the value of space exploration and space utilization. So this is all part of the same goal. I went through something that is really amazing, that few people on planet Earth had the opportunity to go through, and I try to pass a message now to enrich other people and to enrich also communities in the value of what we do in space. Where would I like to go in space if technology existed and was available? I would go to an exoplanet. The solar system is an absolutely amazing and extremely rich environment. We have discovered using probes and robots that there is a huge diversity in bodies in the solar system. When I consider just the satellites of Saturn has, of course, it's a big planet. It has the rings, but it has about 65 satellites. And Cassini has obtained a lot of detailed pictures of some of these satellites, and there's an enormous diversity. There's Enceladus covered with ice, and you have kind of ice geysers when it's illuminated by the sun on the side that is illuminated by the sun. And this is really amazing. And you have other that are big rocks with the craters, and you have enormous diversity. And The solar system is fascinating. We know it reasonably well. Of course, we have visited comet Churyumov-Gerasimenko last year, already 2014 and 15. We continue doing that with the Rosetta, and this also is an amazing environment and great places to send astronaut to also. Why not? Although on a comet you have to be careful because the escape velocity is very small and you need to be careful when you walk, because if you walk too fast you may reach escape velocity and never come back. So you need to use a tether like we do on spacewalk so that you don't escape forever from the surface of the comet. So solar system is fascinating, but long term I would like to go to another planet around another star than the sun. It's not going to happen, obviously, and maybe humanity will never leave the solar system. I don't know. Maybe they will at some point. But my dream is to go to an exoplanet. Why would I do anything differently if I could live my life again? I think the answer is no. I've been so privileged to be able to do what I did that and it's because of the path I chose, but mainly because I was influenced by people who inspired me and who helped me, and I was fortunate also to be lucky. And I worked, of course, but I had a lot of luck. And I don't think I would direct my life differently if I had to redo it. Of course, it's an impossibility. We know we can't travel in time in the past and do things differently. But no, I think I would live the life that I've been living through, and I would make the same choices. And I was extraordinarily privileged to be able to do what I did. From which country will be the first human on Mars and when? I have no idea from which country he or she will be. Obviously, we have some countries that we can think of, like United States and Russia and Europe and China and India, Canada, Japan. But this first human on Mars could be from Korea, or from Zimbabwe, or from I don't know which country. But I have no idea. It's likely to be a citizen, man or women, from one of the countries who are the partners of the International Space Station, because of course they went through a big step in this direction, plus China and India, which are the rising space powers with a lot of will and a lot of talents. So I would say the ISS partners plus China and India are the most likely ones, but in fact, for sure, I don't know. I think it will happen this century for sure, and I think in all likelihood before the middle of this century, before 2050, we'll have people walking on Mars. Okay, what did I think about the days before going to space and the seconds before liftoff? The days before, I was very excited. I was always very excited. I was looking forward to the big adventure. Again, there was no concern and fear. The only concern that I had somewhat was during the powered ascent to space, about 8.5 minutes from liftoff until main engine cutoff. But during the days before, I was really, really, really looking forward. The reason why the feeling was all positive was that the training was always very good. And I think this is what gives you confidence that you can do something if you have enough training. There was a solid training behind us, the whole crew, and we were confident that we could do the mission successfully, even if we had a number of problems, because we had trained to solve problems and accomplish the mission goals, even though we were going to possibly meet with adversity. That's the feeling a few days before, and even the night before. Excited, looking forward to the adventure. The seconds before liftoff, I must say, for me, I was always thinking of what do you do, Claude, in case things go bad. And it's the same thing in aviation. Before you put the throttle forward, especially in an airplane like a jet airplane, and even more so in a multi-jet airplane with 2 or 4 engines, you put the throttle forward to take off. And you need to think about what you do in case you have problems. And this attitude of a professional aviator, which was mine in aviation, I had it also before liftoff, because there were some abort scenarios where we had to evacuate as rapidly as possible the space shuttle, and you need to do it in a certain order. You need to do certain tasks. Each of us had a certain number of tasks to perform in order to do a rapid and orderly evacuation of the spacecraft in case of a problem. In the seconds before liftoff, I was thinking, Claude, what do you do in case you have a launch abort? That's probably my education in aviation. That's the same thought that you had before putting the throttle forward for takeoff from the runway.